Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Alan Hayes for inviting me here. Hear me okay? And I want to thank Alan and the whole Institute staff for the very gracious hospitality that they have extended to me during my stay here. It's great to be back in Melbourne again. I lived here for 6 years, and I love this place. It's a great city. So today I am talking about marriage, cohabitation, and health, and I want to let you know that I'm defining health very broadly. That is, I'm defining health to include physical health, mental health, and a general sense of psychological well-being. Now, people have been talking about this topic for a long time. And when I say a long time, I mean a really long time, for thousands of years, in fact. Some of the Greek philosophers discussed whether marriage actually makes people happier. And in fact, Socrates advised the young men of Athens to, as he said, to get married, because if you find a good wife, you will become a happy person. He also said, however, that if you find a bad wife, you will become a philosopher. Now, Socrates apparently was very unhappily married, which may be why he was such an excellent philosopher. Who knows? Okay, so let's move on. Although people have been talking about marriage and health for a long time, the scientific study of this issue, I think, began with the work of the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, who published a book in 1897, Le Suicide, in which he collected data, statistics from various European countries. And he was able to show that married people had a lower rate of suicide than single people. And this was true all across Europe. And interestingly, we find the same thing today. Durkheim thought that there was something about the social integration and support of marriage that protected people from suicide. Well, since then, there have been dozens and dozens, perhaps hundreds of studies that have looked at this topic. And the general finding from this research literature is that, indeed, people who are married have better physical health than people who are single, better mental health, they tend to be happier with their lives, and they even live longer. In fact, some studies suggest that married people live about 10 years longer than people who are single. So we're talking about pretty big effects. And interestingly, some very recent research suggests that this holds for same-sex couples who are allowed to marry, as well as heterosexual couples. So it appears to be a very broad thing that we're talking about. Now, let's assume for the moment that marriage actually does improve people's health. Why might that be the case? Well, people have identified 4 different explanations for why this might be the case. And I'm going to talk about each of these fairly briefly. First, social support. Obviously, if you're married, your spouse is someone who can provide a lot of support to you. Your spouse is a source of intimacy, companionship, love, affection, and everyday assistance. Spouses also connect you to a wider network of kin and friends. So, for example, when I married my wife, in a sense, I married her family too, and all of her friends, and they became part of my social network. So I now have a bigger network of people that I can draw upon for assistance and support. Spouses reinforce healthy behaviors. When a wife says to her husband, "You know, you really should stop smoking. You know, you should drink less. Don't forget to take your medications. It's time for you to see a doctor for a checkup," she's nagging him, but in a very good way, right? This is one thing spouses are supposed to do. We're supposed to nag each other in ways that are beneficial, to remind each other of the things we should be doing to look out for ourselves. This is one of the benefits of marriage, is being nagged in a positive way. And finally, spouses are people that we really matter to in a deep sense. When you are down on your luck and you feel like the whole world is against you, your spouse is the one person that you know in this world who truly cares about you. That's a very powerful thing. Spouses are people for whom we matter in a very deep sense. And that should make us feel better about life in general, I would think. A very different kind of explanation refers to the fact that marriage is institutionalized. That is, marriage is regulated by a set of norms and laws and social conventions that tell us what to do, that define spouses' rights and responsibilities to one another. These rules that surround marriage provide standards of appropriate behavior. We know how to behave once we're married. We understand what our rights and responsibilities are as a spouse. And these responsibilities and rights and standards are reinforced by the people in our social networks. We also gain social status from being married, because marriage is a valued institution. You've probably heard conversations where someone says, or announces rather, we're going to be married in 6 months. And what do people do when they hear that? They say, oh, that's wonderful. Congratulations, we're so happy for you, right? Marriage is a valued thing. You receive support from other people when you marry. And of course, marriage provides a lot of legal protections and benefits to people. For example, my wife receives her health insurance through me, through my job in the United States. If she weren't married to me, she wouldn't have health insurance. Another thing that you can look at is commitment. Marriage, by definition, implies a very long-term commitment to a relationship. And that has some very positive advantages. For one thing, if you're in a long-term committed relationship, it reduces uncertainty. I don't have to worry about who I'm going to go out with on Friday night. I'm going to take my spouse out. I don't have to worry about who I'm going on vacation with in 3 months' time. I'm going to go with my spouse. My life becomes ordered and regular and predictable in good ways because I'm married. The long-term commitment of marriage facilitates joint investments in the relationship. If you know that you're going to be with someone for a long time, it makes sense to buy a house with that person, to take out a mortgage, to have children. Partners also, in a long-term committed relationship, can forego short-term self-interest for the good of the relationship. If my spouse gets into trouble of some sort, makes a bad decision, and I need to bail her out, that's okay, I don't mind doing that. And I don't expect to be repaid for that, or even thanked for it necessarily, because I know that in the future, I'm going to mess up, and I'm going to need her help, right? In the long term, these things will all balance out, but I don't worry about it in the short term, because I know this relationship is going to last a long time. And then finally, if you're with someone for 10 years, or 20 years, or 30 years, you gain a shared history together. Your marriage becomes part of who you are, part of your identity. And the marriage becomes a source of deep meaning in your life. You don't get these things from short-term relationships. You only accrue these benefits when you're with someone in a long-term committed relationship. And of course, there are financial advantages of marriage. For one thing, when you live with someone, you gain from economies of scale. You don't need to buy 2 refrigerators. You don't need 2 washing machines. You don't need to pay rent twice. You benefit economically. You save money. Spouses can pool their income and they can accumulate wealth more quickly than a single person can. And if one partner is going through a difficult time economically, the other partner can step in and help out. So if my wife loses her job, maybe I can increase my hours of employment to get us through until she finds a new job. Spouses can cooperate economically and they can become more secure economically. Two people can become more secure economically working together as a team than a single person can. So if you think about it, there's a lot of reasons why marriage might actually provide a benefit to people with respect to their health and happiness and sense of well-being. But then this raises some questions. Well, what about other kinds of relationships? What about cohabiting relationships? What about what we call living apart together relationships, or LATs, where two people love each other and have a sexually bonded relationship, but choose not to live together because they like to have separate residences and some degree of independence. Do these kinds of relationships confer similar benefits on people? Well, we can kind of map this out and think about it. So in this figure, we have the three kinds of relationships: marriage, cohabitation, and LATs in the columns. And we have the four types of benefits one gets from relationships. With respect to social support, if social support is the key thing, if it's really all companionship and intimacy and love, that's the key thing that protects people's health, well, any kind of relationship can provide that, right? Doesn't matter if you're married or you're cohabiting, or if you're in an LAT relationship, you can still get all of those kinds of benefits from the relationship. So maybe it doesn't really matter if you're married or not, as long as you have a close, intimate relationship. Maybe that's the key thing. But if it's institutionalization that's the important thing, then marriage is clearly the best option, right? Marriages obviously are highly institutionalized. LATs are very low in this respect. Cohabitation is sort of, I would say, in between somewhere, and it depends a little bit on where you live. In the US, cohabitation is really not institutionalized at all. In other countries, in Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries, in Canada, in New Zealand, cohabitation is more institutionalized. In Canada, once you've lived together for 3 years, you gain all the legal rights and benefits of marriage, right? So it's sort of in between the two. Commitment, obviously high in marriage, lower in living apart together relationships. And I would argue that cohabitation is sort of in the middle on average. Now, it's true that some cohabiting couples are deeply committed to one another. On the other hand, if you interview people who are cohabiting and you ask them, well, why don't you just get married? A very common response that you get from people is, well, we're not really quite ready yet for that kind of commitment. So, financial benefits, obviously very low in LATs. You don't really gain anything economically from being in a relationship with someone if you're not really living with that person, or you don't gain a lot. Cohabiting relationships, well, you do get all the benefits of economies of scale if you're living with someone. On the other hand, we know that cohabiting couples tend not to pool their incomes, so maybe you don't get quite the same economic benefit. At any rate, if you think about how all this plays out, you might be led to conclude, well, maybe it's the case that you get the most benefit from marriage, the least from LAT-type relationships, and maybe cohabitation is kind of in the middle somewhere with respect to how beneficial they are for health. So let's look at a few previous studies, just for the heck of it. This is a study that looked at people's rating of how happy they were with their lives. And this study was conducted in 4 countries: the United States, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. And we have the average happiness ratings for people who are single, cohabiting, or married. And you can see in this figure that, in general, married people tended to be happiest, single people tended to be the least happy, and people who were cohabiting were sort of in the middle. In all countries except for New Zealand, where there was no difference between people cohabiting and married. But again, this suggests maybe that cohabitation might give you some of the benefits of marriage, but not quite all of them. And I will just, as an aside, just point out, I don't know what happened to Australia here. I don't know. The study was done in 2002, and maybe that was a bad year here in Australia. I don't know. But for some reason, irrespective of relationship status, people in Australia were just not as happy as people elsewhere. So who knows? Maybe you have some insight into that. Here are some results from a study I published a few years back with one of my students, Claire Dush. And we were working with this idea of a continuum of commitment. And the outcome here that we're looking at is a composite measure of psychological well-being, which includes things like feeling good about your life, being happy, having few symptoms of depression. And what we found was that people who were married had the highest level of well-being. Cohabiting people had the second highest level. People who were dating someone steadily were kind of in the middle. And people who were dating a lot of people at the same time or not dating anybody had the lowest level of well-being. So these findings suggest, well, maybe there is this continuum of commitment. The more committed the relationship, the bigger the payoff in terms of your sense of well-being. Okay, so we've been talking about some of the benefits of relationships and marriage in particular, but let's stop and think about what some of the limitations of marriage might be. It's quite possible, for example, that there are early benefits of marriage that tend to fade over time. We know, for example, that when people are first married, they tend to be very happy with the relationship and happy with their lives. And over time, the marriage becomes less satisfying, on average, for many people. People start, the honeymoon period wears off, and people start, they take out a mortgage, they're paying off a mortgage, they have children, looking after kids, they're not going out as much, there's more work to be done. And for a lot of people, the early, that ecstatic period of the first year tends to become more mundane as time progresses. So maybe there are some benefits of health, but only in the first few years of marriage. And then that fades away. It's quite possible. And what about the idea that marriage might be less advantageous for wives than for husbands? Jessie Bernard's famous book, The Future of Marriage, she argued that marriage is a better deal for men than it is for women because marriage is unequal. Well, I think marriages today are less unequal than they used to be, but they're still unequal. So maybe there's a gender thing going on there that we need to think about. And then we have to deal with a really serious problem in trying to make sense of this research literature. That's the problem of selection. We know that people don't marry at random. People who marry are different from people who don't get married. In fact, people who marry tend to be well-educated compared with single people. People who get married tend to earn more income. People who marry early in their lives tend to be very emotionally well-adjusted, physically healthy. They tend to hold traditional values. They're more religious. So the factors that lead people into marriage are also the kind of things that might make people score very high in a survey when they're asked about how happy they are or how good their health is. So we're kind of left with this way of thinking about it. We have certain selection factors. Some people are genetically predisposed to be physically healthy and to have good mental health, right? And these selection factors might lead them to interrelationships. And these same selection factors on a survey might at any particular time lead them to score very highly in terms of how healthy they are, physically, mentally, and so on. The question is, do the relationships have any direct effect on health, net of all these selection factors? Is it the case that marriage makes people healthy, or is it simply the case that healthier people are more likely to marry? Right? So this is a very difficult thing to sort out. And the reason why we can never completely sort out this problem is because we can't do experiments with this topic. You know, if we could take a pool of people and randomly assign them to get married, or cohabit, or be single, and then follow them up in 10 years and see how healthy they are, we could answer this question. But we can't do that, obviously, for ethical reasons, for lots of reasons. Although actually in thinking about this, I believe there is one place where you could do that experiment, and that's in North Korea. But, you know, in the rest of the world, the civilized world, you can't do things like that. So we can never really do an experiment to solve this. So how do we try to get some kind of feel for what's going on? Well, the best we can do is use statistical models that get us reasonably close to where we want to be in terms of reaching causal conclusions. Now, fixed effects models are a particular kind of statistical technique that economists have been using for a while. More recently, other social scientists have sort of discovered these and started to use them. And fixed effects models are very useful when applied to a question like this: does marriage affect health? Because fixed effects models control for all stable background characteristics of people. They control for people's personalities, many of their genetic predispositions. They control for things like race, ethnicity. They control for family background. They control for a lot of things that we want to control for to understand how marriage affects people. Now, to my knowledge, there are only 3 studies out there in the research literature that have applied fixed effects models to understand how marriage and cohabitation affects health. I'm going to talk about these 3 studies very briefly because, well, there's only 3 of them. So the first study was conducted in the Netherlands. The outcome in this study was subjective well-being. And in this study, they found that married people had a higher level of well-being than cohabiting people. People who were cohabiting were better off than people who were dating, and people who were dating were better off than people who were single. They found that there was some decline in subjective well-being over time. Once people entered relationships, there was a gradual decline. But even after many years, people were still better off in these relationships than they had been when they were single. And they found no gender differences. So this study kind of supports the idea that relationships are good for you, and marriage might be especially good for you. Then we have another study by Musick and Bumpus using American data. They looked at happiness, depression, self-rated health, and self-esteem. And they found that, that married people seem to be better off than cohabiting people, and cohabiting people seem to be better off than people who were single, sort of. But it was only for some outcomes. And in fact, the findings were very inconsistent. And they found that those few beneficial effects that they noted tended to disappear with time. So their study kind of leads us to conclude that, well, maybe, net of all these selection factors, there's really not that much of an effect of relationships on health. And then finally, we have a third study from Canada where the researchers looked at functional health problems, overall self-rated health, and depression. And they found that transitioning into marriage or cohabitation had no beneficial effect on any of these outcomes. But they did find that the longer that people were married or the longer they were cohabiting, the worse off they were. So we have 3 studies that yield 3 entirely different sets of conclusions, right? And unfortunately, this happens sometimes in the social sciences. So what do? We can either say, well, the heck with it, we'll never know the answer. Or we can keep doing more research, because I think you need more than 3 studies to see what's going on. You need to have a critical mass of studies to get a feel for what the overall pattern is like, what the overall finding is like. So in that spirit, I decided to do more research on this topic. What I'm going to be doing today is talking about some of the findings from this research project I'm involved in at the moment. This particular analysis I'm going to show you today draws from the longitudinal study of adolescent health, or AdHealth, as it's known. The study has 4 waves of data. It was first initiated in 1994 and 95, and the sample consisted of about 19,000 high school students. Well, students in high school and junior high, which is grades 8 through 12 in the US. There was a second wave of data that was just 1 year later. I'm not going to use that. There was a third wave, which took place in 2001 and 2, when these young people were now 18 to 26 years of age. And there was a fourth wave of data collected in 2007 and 8, when these young people were 24 to 32. Now, this is a good data set to use because it's following young people through the prime years in which they first cohabit or first marry, right? So we're catching young people as they go from being single into their first major relationship. And we don't have to worry about, complicated relationship histories. We're catching them during their first relationship transition. So it's a good data set to use to study this question. Now, my variables, I'm looking at non-marital cohabitation, marriage. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to look at dating or LAT relationships because they asked questions about relationships in different ways, in different waves, which messes up the models. So I couldn't do that in this particular analysis. In terms of the health outcomes, we have, first of all, a self-rating of health, in which people are asked, well, overall, how healthy would you say that you are these days? And people rate their health from poor to excellent. Depression. We have 9 items from the CESD depression scale. This is a very commonly used survey measure of depression. Scores on this depression scale correlate very highly with clinicians' judgments of depression. People are asked about suicide ideation. In the last 6 months, did you ever think seriously about committing suicide? Alcohol consumption. During the last 12 months, in a typical month, on how many days did you drink alcohol, on how many days did you drink 5 or more drinks in a row, and on how many days have you gotten drunk or very high? And I've combined these 3 items to produce a scale with high scores reflecting heavy alcohol consumption. And finally, smoking. During the last month, on how many days did you smoke 1 or more cigarettes? Now, there's different ways that you can measure smoking. What I'm doing here is measuring it so that we're looking at people who have been tobacco-free for the previous month. And then, as I said before, fixed effects models control for everything that's stable in people's lives, which need to also control for things that are changing. So I'm controlling in these models for age squared, because not everything is linear over the life course. Things change often in a curvilinear way. Years of education, hours of employment, and whether people have children. And very briefly, you can see how some of these variables change over time. Age obviously goes up. Years of education increases. Hours of employed increases from sort of part-time work during high school to full-time employment during adulthood. Having children, only 2% of high school students have children. 51% of people and young adults in the sample have children by the time they're in their late 20s, early 30s. Marriage increases, as does cohabitation. So a lot of things are changing in this particular part of the life cycle. A lot of change going on. Very quickly, a correlation matrix between the outcomes I'm looking at. I'm showing this to you just so you see that the correlations between these outcomes are not that high, which indicates that we're looking at 5 relatively independent dimensions of health and well-being. The highest correlation is between smoking and drinking, right? Which is perhaps not surprising. But it's not really a super high correlation. Now I'm going to show you some tables, but very briefly. I'm not going to focus on the tables too much. I'm going to be showing you some figures instead that show you the most important results, and the figures are much easier to interpret. But just briefly, you can see that from the table here for self-reported health that I have separate models for men and for women because I'm interested in gender differences. And there's going to be a coefficient for marriage and a coefficient for cohabitation. And then I have a duration variable that reflects the effect of length of time in that relationship. And all the other variables are in there, they're just not shown in the table. So in this particular instance, for this particular outcome, you can see that there's really nothing going on for men. But for women, we're getting a significant effect of marriage, and we're getting a weak effect here of duration in marriage. Now let me show you what that looks like. Now here's how to interpret the figures I'm going to show you. This line here shows us the trajectory of self-reported health for a woman or for a group of women who remain continuously single from age 16 to 32. You can see that self-reported health declines over time as women go through their 20s into their early 30s. Now here we have a group of women who marry at age 25, which is the average age of marriage for women in the sample. And what happens is when they marry, they experience a little bit of a bump in self-reported health, perceived health, a little bit of an improvement, but over time it tends to fade away. So after a few years, they're really no better off than they would have been had they remained single. So nothing really to write home about here, right? This is not a big headline kind of finding. But there's some more interesting ones coming up. So here we have depression, the results for depression, and you can see that for both men and women, there's a marriage effect, but also there's a cohabitation effect. And we also see for women, there are some duration effects going on. So to understand what all that means, let's have a look at the figure. Now we'll go through this slowly so you can kind of get the feel for it. We'll start with men down here. Here we have the trajectory of depression for a man who remains continuously single throughout his 20s into his early 30s. We'll see that depression tends to go up a little bit as people get older. Now, if a man cohabits here at the average age of cohabitation for a man, which is 23, his depression level goes down, and it tends to stay down relative to what it would have been if he had remained single. It's going up a little bit here for everybody, but it's going up for cohabiting men at about the same rate, so they still have this advantage relative to people who are single. And here we have a man who marries at age 27, which is the average age of marriage in the sample. And again, his depression goes down, and it tends to stay down relative to what it would have been if he'd been single. So we see for men that marriage and cohabitation lowers symptoms of depression and that benefit persists over time. Now for women, over here, we see depression goes down a little bit from adolescence and then bottoms out and tends to increase a little bit if they're single. Here we have women who cohabit. Depression goes down in the first year following cohabitation. Here we have women who marry. Depression goes down in the first year following marriage. But for both of these groups of women, depression begins to creep back up again, so that after a certain number of years, these lines converge, and the benefit of cohabiting or marriage evaporates. Their level of depression returns to what it would have been had they remained single. Here we have suicide ideation. You can see again some effects here of marriage and cohabitation for men and women, but again a duration effect here for women. Here we have the results for men. Here's our single men. Suicide ideation does not change very much. If they remain single. If they cohabit, thinking about suicide declines, and it stays lower. And if they marry, they're less likely to think about suicide. And that advantage persists over time. So for men, both marriage and cohabitation lowers the probability that they will be thinking about suicide. Now women, a different story. Thinking about suicide goes down from adolescence, and then lower here in the 20s and early 30s. If they cohabit, thinking about suicide goes down. If they marry, thinking about suicide goes down too, but it tends to go back up again the longer they're married. I didn't make this up, all right? Or so much for the benefits of marriage, right? Okay, but bear with me. Alcohol consumption. Again, we see a lot of action here for marriage and for cohabitation for men and women, and some duration effects for women, not for men. We never find duration effects for men. Once they've made a transition, that's it. It's true. Whereas women are more volatile. They change more. All right, so here's alcohol consumption. All right, here's the guys. Men drink more than women, by the way, in case you didn't know that. Men's alcohol consumption goes up from the teen years into the early 20s, mid-20s. It peaks, then it comes down a little bit as men enter the 30s. If men cohabit, alcohol consumption goes down, stays down relative to being single. And if they marry, alcohol consumption goes down, it stays down. Here we have women, more complicated picture, messier picture. Again, we get the same curvilinear effect with alcohol consumption going up and then coming down. Women cohabit, alcohol consumption goes down a little bit, but then it keeps going down. If they marry, alcohol consumption goes down, but slowly it creeps back up again. Never gets quite to where it might have been had they remained single, but this gap tends to close up a little bit over time. Finally, smoking. We get some effects here for marriage and for cohabitation. No duration effects here. So this outcome is a little different. Oh, okay. Here we have men. Smoking goes up, peaks in the mid to late 20s, then comes down a little bit. If they cohabit or if they marry, smoking goes down. In other words, a lot of men stop smoking in the year that they get married. And here we have smoking for women. Here we have the cohabitation effect. If women cohabit, they tend to stop smoking, and that stays the same over time. And for women, if marriage, there's a big drop. And this is the one case in the data where marriage is more powerful than cohabitation. Women are much more likely to stop smoking when they get married than if they're cohabiting. And in fact, the marriage effect here is quite strong. If you look at that, the probability of smoking here declines by about the equivalent of 18 percentage points. A lot of women quit smoking when they get married, and they don't take it up again, right? They don't take it up again. Okay, so some conclusions. What can we make of all this? Well, marriage and cohabitation are both associated with some modest increases in mental and physical health, and it's true for women, and it's true for men. And before I go on, here's a hint for practitioners. Marriage is a time when people change. Marriage is a turning point in the life course. When people get married, and the same thing is true of cohabitation, too. When people enter a residential relationship with a partner, they change a lot of things in their lives. They change their lives in a lot of ways for the better. They tend to become healthier. A lot of people start drinking less, and they stop smoking when they make this relationship transition. So, I lost my slides. Well, I'll have to persevere. So, if you're a practitioner and you want to try to reinforce healthy behavior on the part of your clients, okay, we're good. This is a good time to get them, right? Because there's a lot of positive momentum happening in that year when people are starting to cohabit or when they've married. People are on a good trajectory for making their lives healthier. This might be a good time to intervene and reinforce that, maybe see if you can push it a little bit further. It's a time when people are receptive to change, to positive change. Might be a good intervention point. Okay, so the improvements in health associated with cohabitation and marriage, however, are reduced over time for women, with the exception of smoking. So why is that? Well, it might be because marriage is still not completely equal. But I think it's also related to the fact that satisfaction with marriage and relationships in general does tend to decline for most people, but it declines faster for women than for men. And in fact, some other analyses that I've done with this show that when you take into account the fact that people are becoming less happy with their relationships and less committed to them over time, it completely explains the decline in health for women, right? So the reason why women are showing that the evaporation of the cohabitation and the marriage effect is because they're becoming less happy with their relationships over time. Men become less happy too, but not as much. Now, the results suggest that most, but not all, of the improvements in health and well-being are due to social support rather than institutionalization, right? Because cohabitation seems to have many of the same benefits that marriage does, with the exception of smoking, where the marriage effect is more powerful. I should point out, however, that cohabiting relationships are much less stable than marriages. Much less stable than marriages. In the US, in Europe, and in Australia, cohabiting relationships are 2 to 3 times as likely to break up as marriages are. So yes, cohabiting relationships seem to have many of the same advantages, but they don't last as long as marriage. So, if you're thinking about policy, well, clearly policies that can facilitate the formation of stable unions also confer health benefits on people, right? So if you are into public health policy, relationships are an important mechanism or lever for improving people's health if you can think of policies that strengthen relationships. The problem is, how do we figure out a way to make the benefits more long-lasting, especially for women? How can we build upon those initial benefits we see in the first year or two? How can we stretch that out longer? And of course, what about people who never form relationships? How do we kind of compensate for the fact they don't have this in their lives? And that's it. Thank you.